Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Tree School online webinar for this afternoon, Tuesday, May 5th. I'm Mike Cloughesy, and it's my pleasure to be your host for this afternoon's webinar. I'll be kicking things off, and then I'll be introducing Glenn Ahrens, who is the moderator, and he will introduce the panel, and we'll go forward from there. First of all, though, I have to say that Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forest Education. We want to give a special recognition to OFRI for project leadership and to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for a grant that covers the expenses of this. Tree School Online webinars are scheduled every Tuesday from now until July 28th. We have 2 webinars a day, one at 10 a.m. and one at 3 p.m. We're conducting this on Zoom, as you've probably figured out, and I want to just talk about some Zoom housekeeping stuff. First of all, if you're not used to Zoom webinars, they're a little different than Zoom meetings in that you as participants don't have access to audio or video, but all the stuff you do have access to is on the Zoom toolbar. And if it's not showing right now, if you just move your cursor to the bottom of the screen, the Zoom toolbar should pop up and you'll see participants, Q&A, chat, polls, that kind of stuff. And I want to talk to you about how we're going to use each of those. So the first is the participant list, and you can see on that who the participants are, who the panelists are, who the attendees are right now. There's a total of 56 of us. Have about 90 registered, so I expect we'll get joined by some more. To the right of participant list is the Q&A box, and that's where we're going to be asking you to write your questions. So rather than write your questions in the chat box, which a lot of people do, we're asking you to write your questions in the Q&A box. The chat box we're using just to communicate with panelists if you have questions that you don't know what's up. There's also one that you can raise your hand, but we really can't do anything with you when you raise your hand, just know your hand's up. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. Finally, I just want to say that we're going to be recording this program, and recordings will be available on the knowyourforest.org website and also on the Tree School website. So you can't miss them if you get there. They're pretty obvious. Pretty easy to find. They're recorded and converted to YouTube videos, and so they're really easy to watch. Even people that can't easily access webinars can access YouTube videos. So that should go. The final thing before I introduce Glenn is there should be in your toolbar a box that says polls, and nothing will happen to that when you press it unless I've activated a poll. And we'll have a couple different times during the panel where we'd like your opinion on things or some information from you, and I will bring up the poll. If it doesn't come up in a box, a pop-up box, if you go to this polls button in the Zoom toolbar, it will open it for you. So that's enough housekeeping for an hour-and-a-half webinar. So I'd like to introduce Glenn Ahrens, who is going to be the moderator for today's program. Glenn is a forestry extension agent with OSU College of Forestry. Clackamas County Extension covers Clackamas County, Hood River County, and my home county of Marion. Welcome, Glenn, and thank you for joining us on Tree School Online and being our moderator today.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm glad we can do Tree School in this fashion rather than none at all, especially. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm your extension forester, as Mike said, Clackamas, Marion, Hood River County, also the leader of our Tree School team. And I want to acknowledge the Tree School team in the Clackamas County office, Amanda Brenner and Jean Bremer, who really helped put all this together behind the scenes. So I'm your moderator, and we've got 5 panelists today. So I get to introduce the panelists. And I think we're ready to go to our first panelist.
Okay, before we do that, Glenn, we do have the interim poll.
I was wondering when that was coming in.
Yep, so I just wanted to get you on here first. So folks, this is where I will be sending up a poll, and you'll see down here at the bottom it says poll time, and then there's a thing with the red circle. If the poll doesn't pop up for you, look in your Zoom toolbar for that one poll, and it should then pop up. So this is our first poll. We mostly want to learn about you. So where are you from, meaning right now, not where you were born. A little bit about yourself as a woodland owner or a forestry professional, and then how many acres of forest land do you own or manage? And this scrolls, so when it opened, you probably just saw the first question, but if you scroll down, you can get them all. And there are 56 people in the audience, and so far 18 of you have voted, and I'll let it go for almost a minute until we get the majority of you voting, and then we'll share the results really quickly. All right, 80%, let's go there. Glenn, here's the results. So as most of the webinars we've had, 70% are from the Willamette Valley, few from the coast, very few from Washington State, one from other part of the US, nobody from outside the country. Predominantly woodland owners, 62%, but also private resource professionals, 16%, few agency folks, and a few others. So they could be non-resource professionals, non-woodland owners. In terms of how many acres do they own or manage, 31% zero, but the largest numbers are here, 10 to 40, 40 to 100, 100 to 1,000. Kind of sounds like the average of our woodland owner community. So I'm gonna stop there, move on to the slide and let you go ahead and introduce the first panelist, Glenn, and I will go away.
All right, thanks, Mike. So before I introduce our first panelist, I want to remind everyone we're having 10 minutes for each of the 5 panelists, a little transition between. We're not going to have a question and answer until the end, but when you think of your question, put it in the Q&A so you can capture it at a time, because then Mike's going to go through all the questions and try to get them all. So when it's on your mind, put it in Q&A, and then we'll be talking about it in a couple of sessions after the 5th panelist. And so with that, for our first panelist, we have Steve Zika. He's the CEO of Hampton Lumber, and he's going to address how COVID-19 is affecting the lumber markets, log markets, and sawmilling. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Glenn. For those of you who are not familiar with Hampton, we are a private company owned by the Hampton family. We've been in business over 75 years, and we're headquartered in beautiful Portland, Oregon. The company owns about 143,000 acres of our own timberland in Oregon, plus some timber licenses up in BC. We have 10 sawmills in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. And we're probably the 8th largest lumber producer in the world, probably the biggest in the Pacific Northwest. Not everybody knows that. We don't keep a big profile out there, but we're proud of what we do and how many people. We have about 1,700 employees. What a lot of people don't know about us is we're a large wholesaler as well. So besides selling our own lumber, we sell cedar, we sell panels, we import products from around the world, and we export products to Asia. So it's a pretty exciting business that I'm fortunate enough to run for the Hampton family. In terms of the COVID-19, as you might guess, there's a couple big things that we've been working on. The first one, of course, is employee safety. Keeping employees safe at all times. That means most of our corporate offices are closed. People are working remotely, and actually finding that works pretty well, although from a trading floor standpoint, it's a little bit challenging, but it's worked very good. The challenge, of course, is the sawmills. Everybody asks about that. You're seeing all the terrible incidents in the meat packing plants and food industry. But our sawmills, we've been fortunate so far. We don't have a single positive test yet in all of Hampton, but we worked hard on our policies, which isn't easy when you're in different jurisdictions because British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, all has different rules. But basically we have the sawmills locked down. We're doing distancing, we're doing extra cleanup. And if you've ever been in a modern sawmill, it's not like the old days with a green chain and everybody's kind of shoulder to shoulder pulling off boards. People are far away operating various machines, looking at computer screens, things like that. So it hasn't been that big of a challenge, although clearly like safety meetings, lunchrooms, things like that, you have to find a different way to do that kind of thing. So we've been focused on that, number one. The second thing for the last couple months, primarily in March, was just in making sure that we were allowed to operate. So as you know, a lot of people have been designated as essential industries. And I hope it's not the only reason, but early on, we were deemed an essential industry because of the shortage of toilet paper. People figured out that wood chips are used for production of toilet paper. Also, I think people realize that lumber is important in terms of homes. We have a huge shortage of housing here on the West Coast and other parts of the United States. So keeping the sawmills operating as long as they're safe, I think, was deemed by everybody to be important. So we've been very fortunate as an industry and as a company to keep our sawmills available for running. So Mike, if you go to the next slide, please. So many of you and many of us have been through the Great Recession and haven't forgotten it. Housing starts, as you may recall, we had almost 2 million housing starts in the US. Typically, historically, about 1.5 million housing starts is thought of as normal. Certainly wasn't normal in the Great Recession. We dipped down to about 550,000 housing starts, less than Japan had at the bottom. And our biggest customers at the time were Home Depot, Lowe's, and Habitat for Humanity. That was about it. And I'd run into my friends or people on the street and they go, during the Great Recession, they'd say, well, how's your business going, Steve? You know, and I'd say, well, our volume's down 40% and our pricing is down 60%. How would you operate a business like that? Pretty challenging. I still remember the day that we sold studs for $120 a thousand. Really, really low. The Great Recession was terrible, a lot of bankruptcies. We didn't permanently close any facilities, but we certainly took some shifts off. So how is this recession going to be different? So we're not coming in overbuilt, we're actually coming in underbuilt. If you look at the graph, we've gotten up to about 1.2 million, 1.3 million housing starts. And actually the first couple months of 2020, we were at a pace of about 1.6 million or 1.7 million. So it was going to be a great year in 2020 before all this happened. But like I said, we have a shortage of homes. We're still way underbuilt from where we need to be. And so during this period from 2008, 2009, we've started to climb out. We've seen some steady improvement. We were doing really well. And now all of a sudden, boom, the economy's in a recession or depression, whatever comes out of that. So most forecasts for the year talk about housing starts in the US of about 1 million. Some people a little less, some people a little more, which doesn't sound that bad, other than the fact that if you started the first 2 months at 1.6 million, 1.7 million, to average 1 million, you're going to have some pretty tough months. And that's what we're seeing here right now in the second quarter. However, I think it's important to remember that the housing or the lumber business is diverse. And so you've got, when we sell products, about 40% of our business goes into repair and remodel, about 25 or 30% goes into new home construction, and then another 20 to 30% is in industrial use, which is just packaging, wood molding, a variety of other uses for wood. In addition, you have different regions, different products. So in our business, we have Western Canada, we have Eastern Canada, we have the Pacific Northwest, we have inland, Idaho, Montana, we have the US South, which is the biggest. And then you have different products. You have panels, you have lumber, you have dimension lumber, and studs. So you can't just look at it all as one market or one region. Mike, on to the next one. So as I mentioned, repair and remodeling is a big part of our business, approximately 40% of lumber consumption in the US. And you've seen here in this chart the significant improvements. People haven't been building as many houses, and so a lot of people are improving the houses they have, whether that's adding a new room or a deck or something like that. And you can see in the last year or so, we've been spending about $300 billion a quarter in the United States on repair and remodeling. So this has been a really good market. What's interesting is Harvard Joint Center is kind of one of the few entities that puts out forecasts and tracks repair and remodeling, because it's not easy to capture. It's in a variety of places. And for about the last 6 or 9 months, they've been predicting the repair and remodel was going to start going down, even before we had this recession or COVID-19. And I speak to folks at Home Depot and Lowe's all the time. They're our two biggest customers. They don't see that coming. And they're certainly not planning for shrinking or even with the COVID virus, a downturn. So it's interesting to think of where Harvard has some kind of assumption that somehow maybe it's just they thought more houses were going to be built and there was less repair and remodeling. But Mike, if you turn to the next slide, here's what we've been really seeing in the home center. And again, there's a variety of home center customers around the US. Home Depot and Lowe's by far the biggest, but Menards is also a big customer in the Midwest. This is just home center for Home Depot and Lowe's. And if you look at it kind of pre-COVID-19, in early February, we were averaging about 7 or 8 million feet a week of deliveries to these two important customers. All of a sudden, about mid-March, all these orders started going out. Stay at home, you can't go to work, you can't go to your job. But for the most part, Home Depot and Lowe's were kept open. And if you've been to one recently, there's usually a line. And there's been some complaints about they're selling non-essential products too, but they've been kept open. And look what's happened. In the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've seen record deliveries to Home Depot and Lowe's. So again, I don't know if it's going to last forever. Maybe when people start going back to work, they won't be doing as many of these projects. But for now, if you're a company that sells to these people, and not everybody does, and not every product goes into this market, it's actually been really good and kept a number of mills from curtailing to try and supply this important customer. Mike? So let's talk a little bit about lumber pricing. Lumber pricing is the classic commodity market you learned about in school, supply and demand. And it only takes a little bit where the customers are in charge or the seller's in charge to really make that product price move. And if you're a distributor, you don't really like this kind of volatility. Windows don't move like this, or doors don't move like this, but commodity lumber and panel prices do. Lumber's even more volatile than panel prices, and especially engineered wood. So you can see from this chart, I've listed kind of 3 products, and you can see the volatility. So it's like, if you were not familiar with the lumber market, you'd go, wow, look at this volatility in 2018. For those of us who've been in the business, we had a nice run up. Housing starts were going up in 2017, 2018. Mortgage rates were really cheap. And then we got to the point about mid 2018 where we'd had some transportation issues. We weren't getting products to market out of Canada. There was weather issues in the Midwest and the Northeast. And all of a sudden, you may recall, 30-year mortgage went up to 5%, which for many of us people have been around and their first mortgage was at 12 or 13%, 5% seemed like a bargain. But for people that were stretched, had student debt, weren't used to it, going from 3.5 to 5, really cut off mortgage activity and crash. All the lumber prices went down. And when you go down from $550 to $350 in 3 or 4 months, that is a huge change and really hard to deal with. And all of a sudden, mills are losing money and all our Home Depot inventories devalued. So we don't love the volatility either. We love it when things are really good, but on the downside, it's not a lot of fun. So we had this big crash, and then we were kind of going along in 19, and you can see certain products weren't doing all that well. Western SPF from Canada was pretty weak. Studs were pretty weak because we hadn't seen a lot of closures in stud mills. SPI built a big new mill in Shelton, Washington, had the capacity of 500 million foot studs. So again, supply demand, there was plenty of studs. We didn't see much of a run up in prices. But look what happened to green Doug fir during that period in 2019. Some of you are in Southern Oregon, you know what happened. Swanson and GP shut their 2 green Doug fir mills. Those were big mills. All of a sudden, not enough supply. Up goes the price for green Doug fir. So if you have a mill that makes green products, Doug fir, versus dry products or hemlock or something else, you did pretty well in 2019. So we were all doing relatively well going into 2019, like I said, or finishing 2019, like I said, is going to be a great 2020, and everybody was all excited. And then the COVID-19 hit. So what we've seen is significant curtailments around North America, probably the most curtailments up in Western Canada, where they have very high log prices, some in southern or in the south where they've had some weather issues. Here in the west, we've seen curtailments of various mills. Some are still curtailed, some are starting to come back. At Hampton, we had our quad mill, our big log mill down for a couple weeks. That's running again. Tillamook was down for a week or so. It's running again. So it really does vary by products. The panel guys, we've seen a number of curtailments on the veneer side and the plywood side. Some of those mills are kind of coming back. But again, prices have gone way down, and now they've kind of flattened, and some construction sites are opening up, and we're starting to see maybe things are going to be a little bit better. But if you go to kind of the last slide,
Okay, good.
Nobody is really sure. How long is this recession going to go? Is this a deep recession? Is this a long recession? Do we get the V-shaped recovery? My best guess, and again, this is only a guess, is we're going to be a period when you have issues with people not paying their mortgage. You're already seeing delinquencies go up on mortgages. People are going to lose their jobs. The unemployment numbers are massive, but you got to parse through those numbers to say how many of those are permanent job losses versus people who just will be furloughed. Certainly restaurants, the oil and gas, hospitality, those people are going to be in significant trouble, the airline. So it's going to be wild before they come back. So my best guess is we're going to have a little bump here in the second quarter in our industry where things are going to get a little better, prices are going to go up, but then the fog is going to clear, and you're going to have a pretty high unemployment rate, and likely you're going to have too much capacity, and so lumber prices aren't going to be very good. Log prices follow lumber prices, and so they tend to lag. You know, lumber prices will drop $50, and it may be 2 months or maybe 9 months before log prices adjust. Also, the people that own timberland do have other markets. They can export logs. The Japan export market has been pretty good for a little while. China used to be really good 4 or 5 years ago, then it kind of disappeared. Well, now New Zealand is shut down. They're just starting to open up again. So the Chinese have been buying some logs. So that's keeping the price up of logs a little bit, but really both lumber prices and log prices have been down dramatically. But we hope is just kind of a stabilization, and that these lower mortgage rates will help people. Hopefully the banks will be pretty good about credit, and that'll help. But I believe it's going to be a difficult period for the next couple of years. So thank you for the time, and I look forward to your questions later on. Back to you, Glenn.
And remember to ask your questions while they're on your mind, and we'll catch up with you later. So at this point, Steve, if you would go off, and we'll bring Tammy Cushing on. Thanks again, Steve. All right, Tammy. My pleasure to introduce my colleague, Tammy Cushing. She's I think of her as our OSU Extension Forestry Business Specialist, but her official title is the Starker Chair of Private and Family Forestry, as well as the president, just this year starting as president of the Society of American Foresters. So that's another important role that Tammy plays on the national scene. And we get to have her here in Oregon as a leader as well. So she's going to talk about COVID-19 and effects on the forest economy and the profession. And take it away, Tammy.
Great, thank you, Glenn. Yeah, so today we're going to kind of walk from the higher level all the way down to what's going on at OSU. So I'd like to tell you it's not going to be the same doom and gloom you might have heard from Steve, but we're going to have a little bit of carryover of that and hopefully end on a high note. So Mike, if you'll go ahead and hit my first slide for me. Thank you. So what we know so far, if we start looking at that bigger level, and you all have heard these numbers, I'm sure, or you've stuck your fingers in your ears and don't want to hear these numbers. But the numbers from March are the last reported data on unemployment. And right now, unemployment, as far as the March numbers, that's the highest we've had since 2017. So in the US overall, we were at 4.4%, which doesn't sound very high. And Oregon was at 3.3. However, we all know that since March, really the COVID impacts, if you think about what we looked like the middle of March, March 15th, a lot of us really thought that, maybe we were going to have to be quarantined for a little while. And so really the impacts of COVID aren't in the March numbers. Those are just those first few businesses that did shut the doors in March, knowing that was what was happening, or kind of the front end of it. And so we know that number is going to go up. What the consensus is that the number is going to go up to 16% unemployment in the month of April. And so this graphic doesn't even begin to show what 16% is. The highest number, when you go back up through 1948, the data that was presented on the the Bureau of Labor Statistics, goes back to 1948, and the highest was 10.8% within that time frame. So we're in uncharted territory. And as Steve mentioned, what we don't know is, are these permanent unemployments, are we going to see a lot of these folks hired back up once businesses open? And the reality is, we're not really sure how many of the businesses are going to make it through what just happened. You know, if you look at your downtown restaurants, how many of them were able to sustain having those doors shut for that period of time? Of course, laying off some of their folks was an attempt to get some of the federal aid to those folks. But we don't really know if they'll open back up, and if they'll open back up in the same capacity. Wrapped up in that as well is, I can open my doors to my restaurant, but will you come in? And will I be able to seat the same number of people? And there's so many unknowns in that are going to play out in this unemployment picture. So the consensus number, the forecasting, is that we could be up as high as 19%, and then it's going to take a little while to come back down off of that in a permanent fashion. Mike, if you'll go ahead. Thank you. So of course, when we're looking at unemployment numbers, the next thing we need to think about is what consumers are doing and the consumer spending picture. And so if you think about overall, we know that spending is down. Personally, if I think about my own spending, it went from spending on all kinds of different goods to now really the essentials. If I'm not leaving my house, then obviously what I'm buying has decreased. And so we're seeing some of that in that. If you start stripping out the food purchases and some of the other purchasing, you see different numbers. So if we start putting the whole picture together, personal income is down, as of the last reporting, was down about 2%. Of course, that number will go probably down a little bit further. The personal disposable income, that's also down 2%. But the bigger number and the more important number really is that personal consumption expenditure. What we're spending on those goods that we need has gone down by 7.5% in the month of March. Expect to see that number have dropped even further in the month of April. All that is going to start to roll over time. You know, the real question is, when we open back up, whenever we open back up, and depending on where you're sitting, when we open back up, how much are we going to spend, and are we going to spend the same amount of money that I would have spent in the time frame that I wasn't allowed to leave my house? And I think some of that is just kind of unknown, and that all goes to speak to consumer confidence. And we know that how consumers feel about their own personal financial stability is going to play into all these decisions about consumer spending. Jobs that everybody thought were pretty solid, people may be questioning how solid their job is, as we hear about some of the deficits that some of our more stable institutions are having, and the need to do things differently in the future. So that's going to all impact confidence. Next slide, please. As far as the impact on the forestry sector, if we start moving this down, what does this mean? Well, you saw the numbers that Steve put up on the housing starts. The housing starts right now aren't reflective of what's going on, right? Because those houses were all permitted previously. Some of them might have started in the beginning of March. And so a lot of those are probably going to continue. What we don't know is what that impact is going forward. But I could guess, based on people's confidence, that maybe we're going to step back a minute. Maybe I can stick in the house I'm in and focus on some improvements in my house. So not having gone out to Home Depot or Lowe's, but having a spouse who works at Home Depot, what I'm hearing is that demand is strong in the stores. The plywood, the lumber is what's leaving the store. People are doing a lot of improvements because they're stuck at home. And so those things that we had put off for another day, we now have a little bit more time to do those. So demand is strong. Don't expect to see a whole lot of change in that, although what it may have done is kind of expedited the time frame of people doing that work. We obviously have seen a spike in demand for some pulp products. We all know about the toilet paper shortage. That is a shortage in some ways, but really it's a shortage about where the material is and the format that it's been made into. And so we're going to see a spike in demand for some of that, but that's really not going to impact so much our markets out here. If you'll go ahead, Mike. So what we also know is some of the mills are doing quotas. They are trying to reduce the inventory they have on hand, trying to figure out what the demand is going to be in the stores as things continue going forward. If, as Steve pointed out, we see that trickle back, it starts at the lumber and then it works its way back to the logs. And in the middle is going to be the mill timing. And so what we expect to see is if people are going to build less houses, there's that lag time. Once that decision is made, that'll trickle back to the purchase of lumber. It'll trickle back to the demand for the logs on your property. We've heard of some downtime or temporary closure of mills. We're seeing that with some of our students, even at OSU, that had been hired, and some of them have already lost the job that they hadn't even started because of that downtime or temporary closure. The problem is the employers just aren't sure how long that closure could last. And then, of course, we see conflicting policies. The governor of Washington deemed forestry to be an essential activity. And then we also saw that same governor say that residential construction was not deemed essential. And so that's going to have an impact on our sector as some of our wood flow is going into Washington. Next slide. So there is some good news. I don't want to end it on the bad stuff. There is a lack of value correlation with the stock market. Thank goodness. If you've looked at your stock market reports, you probably shouldn't. It doesn't feel good to look at them right now, but what we do know about forestry is because it's going to continue to grow, it's not correlated with the market. Just because the stock prices all fell, your value in your wood will continue to grow. And part of that is being able to bank it on the stump. One of the really nice things about forestry is not having to cut it at any particular time, of course, barring any personal financial needs. But I have the ability to keep it growing on the stump. It's going to allow it to continue to gain value. And when the markets get better, I can make that decision to go ahead and harvest at that time. A lot of assets, you can't do that with. So there is risk, unfortunately, and the risk in our case is more the biological and environmental risks. Of course, we have fire, insect, and disease, but we don't have that financial risk that so many others see, at least in the short term. Long term, we could see some play in that. Next slide. Oh, thank you. So the impact on the profession, most people are still able to work, at least in forestry, other than some maybe temporary timing. What's been joked about on Facebook and other social media is that we are the ultimate in social distancing in forestry. I have former students who are really happy right now that they chose the field of forestry. They can continue to work. We do see some firms that are potentially experiencing some financial difficulty because they're dependent on, due to their fee structures, commissions off of timber sales. So as the mills start to tighten up, there'll be less harvesting going on, and because there's less harvest going on, then the consulting foresters that are dependent on commissions on sales are going to feel that a little bit. Of course, we see some reduced hiring due to uncertainty of not knowing how long things are going to play out this way. And then, of course, obviously, most of our conferences have been canceled, which impacts us from a continuing education standpoint. And last slide, please. So just real quick to talk about what OSU is doing to continue training the workforce. Most of you know by now that OSU and everybody else went to remote learning through our spring term. We went to remote learning mid-March was about the time that we were turning over terms anyway. So our students are all learning from the comfort of their home. That'll continue through the summer with the expectation that when classes start back up at the end of September, that they will be in person, albeit it may look a little different. Content is now being presented in new and exciting ways to our students. They get to do it remote. One of our faculty members digs soil pits in his backyard and videos that for the students so they can see the soil horizons. So we're having to learn how to be more creative, but they're still getting the same content, just delivered a little bit differently. We do have a new crew of foresters graduating in June. They'll all be looking for jobs. Probably not the best time for them to want to come out, but please be supportive of them in any way you can. And then of course, we have a brand new, beautiful facility that we were going to be celebrating a grand opening of in PV Hall. That building will be waiting for those students when classes resume on campus in the fall. So that's the good news.
Thanks, Tammy, thank you. All right, well, I've got a question in mind, but I'll have to wait just like everyone else. So just want to remind you to put your questions in. Tammy is camera off, and now I'd like to introduce Rex Storm. And there you are, Rex. So Rex is the interim executive vice president for Associated Oregon Loggers. And I've been working with you for a long time, Rex, at Tree School. So this is our version of seeing you at Tree School. Thank you. How is COVID-19 affecting the logging business and the business of logging?
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk here. The COVID disruption, I'll focus on the contract services. Contract services in Oregon really involve reforestation, forestry, harvesting, roading, transportation, and protection. And we're a statewide trade group that represents this segment of the forest community. First off, I'd like to start out by saying that the nationwide market decline in housing and industrial use of structural wood is really the primary impact on the forest contract sector right now. It's not the stay-at-home orders that is really impacting the contract sector. The home building crash that reached upstream within a week of that mid-March stall out of the housing economy, the reduction of American consumerism in housing has reached all the way to the forest, and it reached there very quickly. Today, contract output has been crushed for nearly 6 weeks now. And when I say crushed, I mean that we're down, if you had a statewide average, maybe 30 to 50%. There's a huge amount of inefficiency in the system, and that makes operations more costly. So let me move on next. The actual dealing with the disruption and the orders from a sanitation standpoint it is manageable. It adds costs and it reduces the efficiency. However, forest contractors are very resilient, adaptable businesses, and they have and they will continue to adapt and innovate new ways to continue getting the job done. Next. So a few of the things that are going on in prevention tactics to prevent the spread is distancing on the job site, wiping and cleaning a lot of the touch points of equipment and vehicles. The biggest challenge is transportation to the job site. There's a lot of adjustments there in terms of extra vehicles, limiting ride sharing, additional spacing, even masks, and some mitigation measures there, and extra sanitation. But ultimately, the prevention measures include lots of additional work planning, training, supervisor oversight, pre-screening working of workers, but also the administrative cost of additional leave policies and monitoring is an administrative burden. Nonetheless, we're compromising to maintain health. Next. So from a small business, the rest of my talk is going to talk about the actual business impact that we're experiencing in the contract small business sector. Small businesses, by their nature, don't have a lot of not a lot of extra space. The margins are narrow, so there's not a lot of margin for error in terms of capital, labor, and assets. And forest contracting is very intensive for all three of those components: capital, labor, and assets. Capital, cash flow is king. And cash flow in a small business is generated by production and working. And so if your production is reduced and the efficiencies hampered, you're all of a sudden you're in a cash flow crisis where you don't have enough cash to maintain to systems. And the same applies for workforce. We're already going into this system, into this COVID situation. Workforce was short, and workforce is the competition is keen for workforce amongst the trade sectors, and workers come and go very quickly. In terms of assets, small businesses, many don't have huge reserves, and a lot of their assets and equity are tied up in the very elements of production, their machinery and their equipment. So you can't very well do away with that. Ultimately, reduced profits from reduced production and inefficient production is happening. And so everybody is offered up loans and forgiveness and free money. Well, there's no such thing as a free lunch, as most small businesses know that loans and promises are helpful. They're very helpful. They offer some temporary type stopgap solutions, but ultimately additional loans are mortgaging the future of a small business. And so small businesses have to be very careful about the loan participation. Next. So we look at the duration. How long can a small business, a typical forest business, how long can they go in this current crush situation that we're in? We've talked quite a bit about a V-shaped recovery. So a quick reduction and a quick rebound. Well, right now we're 6 weeks into this. We're 6 weeks into this situation, and I would predict that we're about at the turning point of where a quick rebound from the contract sector, if it doesn't happen in the next week or two, we're probably not going to have a quick contract sector rebound because of the financial, labor, and asset damage will have begun to occur. So we will be moving into the next stage is the bounce. So I've got a W there because it'll be more of a seesaw sort of zigzag challenge of trying to climb your way out of the hole that's been dug. There'll be survival and some starvation tactics, but ultimately my little logo there, I show the log rolling, log burler, and a pond full of alligators. And so if you fall off the spinning log there, you're going to be in the pond of alligators, and that's where we'll be here by June 1st. And then if it goes another month into early July, we'll be really looking at rebuilding. There'll be some capacity loss, and some businesses just cannot survive that duration and that impact. There'll be exits of business and capacity challenges and changes. Next. So the fallout from COVID, the contract businesses, small businesses are more vulnerable than large businesses. They don't, they need to produce to be successful, and obviously this sudden decline that occurred in a 1 week period of time puts us in a tough position. And so forest contractors will be, and we're anticipating some sort of a zigzag climb out of this. The longer the duration, the tougher the climb out of the hole will be. But ultimately, they're investing in contracting. The longer this protracts, the more difficulty it will be to invest in contracting. The more difficult it'll be to compete in the workplace for scarce qualified workers, and the more difficult it'll be to resolve and remedy and to return to the contract capacity that we had before. So there would be more bottlenecks. And lastly, there would be a new paradigm of contracting and purchasing if we go into a more protracted 2 to 3 month sort of situation. And next, what I'll close with is, no matter what the duration of the depth of this, the contracting sector will innovate, and it'll redouble. The forest contractors will redouble their efforts to profit and succeed, because very much so the contract sector finds this to be a rewarding business, sustaining and producing those valuable forest products that Americans and consumers across the globe savor and appreciate. And so I want to end on a little bit happier note and say that, yes, we're down in a hole, and we'll come out of that hole. And again, this will be a great place to work in the forest, and we look forward to making the forest a great place to work again, where people can profit. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. I like ending on a little bit of a positive note, but we do know from experience that there are lots of ups and downs in the forestry business, and there's folks ready to get back out in the woods when things start looking up. So with that, I'll go to our next speaker. Thank you again, Rex. Again, put your questions in the Q&A and save them for the end. And next, I'd like to introduce Ron Graham, Deputy Chief of Fire Protection for the Department of Forestry in Oregon, and is going to talk to us about the effects of the COVID virus on the fire protection, prevention, and what that looks like with fire season coming. So take it away, Ron.
All right, very good, and thank you. Yeah, this has been a very interesting time for us at the Oregon Department of Forestry. When this all started early in March, the department made the decision to close our offices to the general public and have our offices open by appointment only. So that was one of our first impacts from this. And, we're an agency that has many partnerships, strong relationships, so that immediately had an impact on how we do business and is, causing us to change how we do business. Some of the other immediate impacts was, decision-making around canceling meetings and trainings and having to switch our, method of delivering those to remote methods and online and postponing and canceling some. An example was our incident management team training had to be canceled. And, fortunately, if there is a fortunate thing of this, our incident management teams were called upon to serve at the state's Emergency Coordination Center. So we host 3 incident management teams at the Oregon Department of Forestry, and it's somewhat unprecedented time. Our 3 teams each served in a 2-week rotation, helping to organize the state's response at the Emergency Coordination Center. So while we had to cancel our historic training and how we normally do things, our teams got training and they were exercised and they were challenged. They were challenged greatly in a situation that was not a fire. That's typically what we manage is fires. And this was obviously not a fire and a very different environment for our teams to work in, so they had to adapt. Also, we've had staff that are further assisting the state's effort through facilitating a multi-agency coordinating group. And that's a small group of people that are facilitating the lead state agencies in identifying their priority objectives and timelines and how they're going to respond to this. So the department's been very engaged at the highest levels of response, which has been very helpful to forming our response and how we are going to do things as an agency. So early on, again, when this started, the chief of our fire protection division tasked us as an agency and a division to prepare for fire season in light of COVID-19. Typically, we spend a lot of time preparing for fire season when the new year hits. And again, there's a lot of face-to-face coordination meetings and whatnot. And fortunately, as I mentioned previously, the relationships we have are very strong with our partners. And that includes private landowners, industry partners, contract firefighters, other state agencies, local agencies, federal agencies, and even our partnerships internationally through our Northwest Forest Fire Compact with Canadian provinces and across all 50 states. So, having those strong partnerships is allowing us to continue to do business through these virtual meetings, and we're utilizing a lot of Zoom trainings, Zoom meetings. We did all of our Forest Protective Association meetings this spring through the month of April via Zoom. So we're using the technology much like all of you are, all the technology that's available to us. So when the Chief of Fire tasked us with, getting ready for fire season amidst COVID-19, we formed a small group and we started breaking our preparation down into 3 real buckets. One was the preparedness side of things, and we focused on training, bringing back new firefighters. We worked with our national counterparts to come up with a policy that says we can recognize firefighters that were trained and qualified last year, honor those qualifications, onboard them, and get them working. We also identified that new firefighters, we're going to still need that training, and we have to have mitigation measures in place to work with those new firefighters and keep them safe. Ultimate goal is to keep our firefighters safe, that keeps the public and the Oregonians that we serve safe. We also identified that, other training is going to have to be done virtually, postponed, etc., and we're working through some of that now. some of the final pieces of the preparedness piece were prevention. We realized very early on that the more fires we can prevent, the less fires on the landscape, the better off we are. You've seen Southwest Oregon, Jackson, Josephine counties go into fire season as of May 1st. That's one of the earliest starts since the 60s. That's a direct reaction to the complications of COVID-19, the fact that human-caused fires were increasing, and we have drought settling back into that area. So strong messaging to the public. We also worked with several partners to do a joint press release with state agencies asking people not to burn, to consider alternatives to burning. So that was in place. So a lot of effort around preparedness, prevention. And then we focused on initial attack. Again, I mentioned increasing fire activity, human-caused fire activity down in Southwest Oregon. We knew that initial attack was upon us and fire season would be starting soon. So we again worked with partners, state agencies, federal partners, and came up with some initial best practices. We knew we didn't have all the answers right away, and that answers were going to continue as we evolved through the fire season and learn from our lessons. So we came up with some best practices to get our folks going to be able to respond safely. You saw some of the graphics that Rex had, around face masks and PPE for transit, those type of items, as well as making sure that we employ our normal firefighting PPE as we always do. So initial attack has brought upon some very interesting things early on. One of the things we found is, there's challenges with wearing face masks in travel. You get hot, firefighters have experienced a little bit of fatigue, and conditions will only continue to worsen as we get into the summer months and we get warmer. The other thing was social distancing around firefighters on the scene and in vehicles. So we've experienced through lessons learned, less firefighters in one vehicle means more firefighter vehicles showing up in a congested scene. So we're dealing with those things as we go, and we continue to work through those. And then lastly is, our initial attack, our extended attack. We're working very closely with the incident management teams across the region, so Washington and Oregon, nationally, and here in Oregon to identify a plan that safely supports extended attack and our extended attack incident management teams. One of the keys to that for us is to continue our practice of very aggressive and safe initial attack. Much like preventing fires from starting, our goal is to stop fires before they get established and become extended attack. And then we have that added exposure, that added logistical complication of how are we going to deal with the complications due to COVID-19. So that's what we're doing. We're continue to prepare for that. We continue to track through our after action reviews and our lessons learned, and we're calling our plans living plans. We're modifying them as we go. We're communicating to our staff as we go. And again, very much tracking not only what the firefighting industry is doing, but what private industry is doing. Those businesses that have stayed open, we can't, typically we'd have an extended attack fire and we'd set up a large fire camp. That's not going to work in light of this situation. We want to avoid, fire camps becoming the next hotspot or outbreak area for COVID-19. So we'll be looking at, opportunities to support our fire camps virtually, to have to us for feeding and lodging our firefighters to keep them safe. So, that's kind of the work that's ongoing. So far, we've been very successful through our strong partnerships, as I mentioned, and it's going to take all of us, the private landowners, the industry partners that we have, our contract firefighting resources, state and federal partners, and again, our international partnerships that we have. These are all key to us having a successful fire season. And lastly, I'd like to emphasize, there is a role for all Oregonians. Again, we are asking for people to be cautious with fire, to think twice about starting that fire, to take alternative measures to, getting rid of their woody debris. And lastly, we're asking the public to, respect firefighters, give them space on the scene. A lot of people are, not working right now. They're curious when there's a fire. They want to see what's going on. But let's give our firefighters the space they need so again, we can stay safe and serve the public. That's all I have today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ron. And that, we'll go to our last speaker of the panel. And again, look forward to question and answer after Gordon's talk. So I will introduce Gordon. So Gordon is Oregon Tree Farmer of the Year. He and his family have a tree farm, and they are woodland owners down in Lane County, I believe. He's also got a family business, Whitewater Forest LLC, and he's a senior advisor in Forest to Market. So he's going to talk to us about how COVID-19 is affecting small woodland owners, and also the kind of the business in the small woodland owner sector and timber markets, availability of contractors to get the work done, and things like that. And go for it, Gordon. Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. The theme of the Oregon Small Woodlands annual meeting for 2020 was wood, wildlife, recreation, and water, doing the work in our working forests. Though because of the situation that we've got, our annual meeting for the time being has been postponed, and hopefully we will be able to reschedule it for later in the summer. As tree farmers, we're really fortunate to live out in the country where we're free to travel and spend time working in the woods. The photos here on this slide are provided by a Lane County member of some pruning to reduce ladder fuels, the young stand, kind of their before and after. These have been disappointing times, as Steve told us earlier. You know, in mid-February, all looked good. Housing starts were encouraging, log demand and prices were up from last year. One of my neighbors was selling some nice logs of his at around $800 a thousand. Then 1 week, beginning in March, the bottom just dropped out. Most mills suffered downtime, some closed for 2 weeks or more. There are still many layoffs in the mills and in logging. The order files for lumber and plywood are thin and prices are down. The mills that supply the big box stores are moving wood, but still at reduced rates. Mills are buying few, if any, logs. Most are off the market and only honoring the commitments they've made earlier. Prices are off more than $150 a thousand, or 20 or 25%. The future is very uncertain. I think likely you can expect that mills won't buy logs again until at least June and probably into early summer. Some of the mills are guardedly optimistic, and yet others are not so much. Now is not a time to be logging your timber if you can avoid it. One thing I would mention is there's still some salvage from last year's snow event, and most mills are very cautious about snow damage. So if you have that kind of timber, you know, you're going to have to be aware of that. Next slide, please. Times good or bad, relationships with contractors are very important. Should always seek good, qualified, reliable people to do business with. Build and maintain good relationships with the mills, with the loggers, and with forest contractors. Currently, you should be thinking about being reliable, always be reliable, predictable in your follow-through, and strive to be a preferred customer. Currently, forest labor contractors are working and still taking on new contracts for spraying, pile covering, and other forestry work. The photo on the right is a release spray that we did just a couple of weeks ago on a new plantation of ours. You know, you might consider that it's likely good timing if you have excavator work, roads, brush piling, culvert repair, projects that normally it would be hard to find a contractor to do. This might be a good summer for it. Some of the things that we've been doing on our own forest lands, we've been working on road maintenance and brushing prior to fire season. Next slide. There we go. We've been working to improve family recreation opportunities, clean up of existing, some of our existing sites, and we built some new hiking trails and bridges on our Penroad Tree Farm. Next slide. you might think about that it's a good time to cut firewood, have plenty for you, and have enough where you might share with another family or some elderly neighbors. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, there we go. Wildlife habitat projects. This is one we've been working on where we're looking at creating biodens, improving habitat for both large and small wildlife, shelter, predator avoidance, and foraging opportunities. Next slide. Think about fire season. Prepare your forest by taking a look at your hand tools, your machinery, and water sources, and make sure they're ready for summer. Next, I guess in closing, I'd like to put in a word for being generous. Generous with your time and whatever resources that you can spare. Think about helping those in your community who may be less fortunate and maybe going through rough times. With that, I'll close. Thank you for joining us for Tree School Online today.
Thank you, Gordon. Well, I think I'll have to pick up some more questions for you as our woodland owner representative, because I have a lot of those. So I'm hoping our audience has questions. And I believe it's time to transition to to bring the panel back on. I think we're all here. All right. Well, I guess as the moderator, I get to start off with some questions that have come to me, and then Mike's going to help feed me some of the questions that have come from our audience over time. And so with that, actually, I've been trying to keep track of you and also think of my questions that I want to ask. So I guess I'll start off with Steve. Do you see any shifts in the relative strength of our Pacific Northwest wood markets? How is the Oregon and the Northwest doing in terms of the global wood market? There's always been a lot of competition lately, and do you see any of that shifting around with the pandemic? What's your outlook?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because about 3 or 4 years ago, Pacific Northwest was a pretty challenging area to do business in, and a sawmiller, after the Great Recession, all of a sudden China started exporting so many logs, it made it really difficult to maintain operation as a sawmill in the Pacific Northwest. That started to slip a little bit. You had a little more reasonable log prices, but everybody was looking down south saying, hey, I got to build a mill down there because they start harvesting at 16 years and fully clear cut in like 23 years down there. So it's pretty attractive. And if you're up in BC where you've had the pine beetle that's killing all your timber, there was a lot of mills being built down in the south. And as a company, we're looking at where to invest and saying, wow, look at those trees and look how fast they're growing. Why wouldn't everybody go down in the south? We chose not to just because everybody else was doing it. And we tend to be a little stubborn and contrarian. And actually the last couple of years, Pacific Northwest has been pretty competitive. What we found, number one, is BC is timber challenged, so you're not going to see any growth there. And down in the US South, they don't have the workforce that we do. For a while, it was really cheap to hire people down there, but you couldn't find the expertise. Now with Boeing and a bunch of people doing manufacturing down there, it's harder to find, especially tradespeople. And so also with all those mills starting up, they flood the market. And so it hasn't been the panacea that everybody thought in the South. Doesn't mean it's a bad market. But actually in the last 2 or 3 years, the Pacific Northwest has been okay. So we think it's reasonable to operate in the Pacific Northwest. We feel we're always at risk related to new environmental regulations or litigation that happened like in the Forest Service. You may have read about a new effort by the industry and the environmentalists to come together to see if we can do some compromise in terms of forest practices, things like that. So I'm optimistic that we can come together on more of a collaboration that you started to see on Forest Service, but maybe also on private land. So I'm pretty optimistic for the Pacific Northwest. But you get nervous for sure. There's a lot of new taxes, things like that coming on here on the West Coast. And with the recession, the state is going to be hurting for money. The cities are going to be hurting for money. And you hope they don't forget that employers and getting jobs are important here as they look at alternatives going forward.
All right. Thanks, Steve. I have a question for you, Tammy. On campus at OSU, what's kind of the outlook for new students coming into the College of Forestry and just keeping things going with the new way of learning on campus?
Sure. So our numbers haven't changed as far as the number of students that we've accepted into the program. So the program's been growing over time, which is a good thing. So it's a very healthy, vibrant forestry program. What we don't know, because this is uncharted territory, there's this difference between students who accept and students who actually walk through the door in the fall. And so not knowing how the current situation is going to impact whether students actually show up in the fall. We don't expect that to be different for forestry students from other students as a whole. But the ones that show up, we'll be ready for them. Class sizes might change. So instead of it being one section of a class with 60 students in it, it might now be two sections with 30 students so that we can spread them out appropriately. Of course, with classes being field-based, that's definitely an argument how forestry can continue to go as far as a teaching situation if we can get the students out in the field. But I think right now we have a marketing opportunity in forestry to show people that this is the ultimate social distancing, that those of you that wanted to be out by yourself in the woods anyway, here's the perfect time to do it. Yeah. Yeah, we're optimistic that the students are going to be good, and we've got a brand new building to showcase and new learning places for them.
All right. Well, I know you get to teach some classes there in addition to the other things that you do. And so I'm looking forward to all fall term being open at our new PV Hall.
Yep.
Staying on kind of the young people in the workforce, Ron, I was wondering, we work with a lot of young people in the youth education and in extension forestry, and here at our Hopkins demonstration forest in Clackamas County, a lot of those are interested in wildland firefighting. What's it look like for the new workforce of young trainees that are coming on, this year?
Well, we're planning for fire season as we always do, and we are in that process of hiring seasonal firefighters, like I mentioned, and we've modified our training and onboarding for those new seasonal firefighters, and with the mitigation measures that we're implementing, we want to ensure them that we're going to provide a safe working environment in the inherently dangerous industry that we work in, of course. But we're doing everything we can, at this current time. All of our districts across the state are hiring those seasonals, and we're looking forward to a good season. Typically, we see a bit of a turnover every year throughout the districts. We can have as much as 25 to 50% turnover per year in seasonal firefighters, folks that move on to permanent jobs. Some of them were just in it for, 1 or 2 seasons or through their college years. So there's plenty of opportunities. And again, those recruitments are open. We're in the process of hiring, and we look forward to seeing those applicants.
All right, good. I think for Gordon and Rex too, possibly, but just thinking about the greater workforce, Gordon, you were talking about, take advantage of the opportunity to get the work done. First, do you see, the availability of the contractors are there? If woodland owners are looking to hire folks to do tree planting and control weeds and all that isn't affected by the pandemic, the work needs to be done. And also, how much do you think folks are taking advantage of time to do the work themselves? So, Gordon, I'd ask you to reflect on that.
Well, I think that there's actually some of each. I know that we've done a tremendous amount of work on our own tree farms, and they've never looked so good. And at the same time, it is a great opportunity if you have work for a forest contractor. I was visiting with a fellow that does a lot of handwork for me yesterday, and talking about some spraying that we might do later in the summer, and he was certainly anxious to do it. And I think it's it's going to be a good time to take advantage of getting work done this summer.
And Rex, some of the logging contractors, do a lot of those businesses kind of branch out and do other kinds of forestry work? Is that a kind of a backup for them, some other work to do when the logging isn't as busy?
Well, every contractor has their basket of skill sets and equipment sets, and so many of them over the years have created a broader diversity so they can do different tasks. But ultimately, in today's business world, you have to be really good at whatever you try to do. And so that tends to force businesses to have just a narrow set of skills and expertise that they can be highly competitive at, because that's the only way you can succeed. So yes and no, that does happen. Yes.
Yeah, well, that side of the business, there's a lot of cost to keep all those machines running as well that you couldn't take care of on the side. Well, I could ask a few more questions, but I want to kind of shift along and let some of our audience questions come through. And so I think with that, I'll let that my time close out, and let's look for some audience questions. I think we're going to take a little break here in between. Mike, are you there?
Yes, I am. And before we go into the audience questions, I always like to do a little plug for our next show. And we're also going to put up the closing poll so we can all have an opportunity to vote. So this isn't the last webinar. There's two more next Tuesday, one at 10 o'clock featuring Daniel Lavelle. It's going to talk about wildfire. Is there wildfire in your future forest and what you can do about it? And on the left here, this is a little shortcut link. The beav.es/tree school online takes you right to the page to register for these. Then our afternoon next Tuesday is Dana Sanchez is going to talk to us about coyotes. It's called Coyotes Wild and Free. And that just, makes me want to howl. So while we're doing this, thinking about next week, I want to put up our closing poll, and I will leave this up for the rest of the webinar until it looks like most people have filled it out. And then, because I know from my experience that some people are going to leave sooner than later, and we don't want you to leave, but before you leave, we would like you to answer these questions. And these are about how we did, what we could do better, and that kind of stuff. So I'm going to leave it in this mode, and I'm going to reopen the polling questions. And sorry, that's the wrong one. Reopen the Q&A. Perfect. So we got 11 questions that have come in. The first one is for Steve Zika. Are Hampton mills reducing the amount of logs they are buying currently?
Yeah, thanks, Mike, for that question. I was interested to hear Gordon and Rex talks as well about contractor activity. Our mills are up in Northwest Oregon. I think Southern Oregon tends to be a little bit different. They carry larger log inventories. We tend to focus a lot on lean, which is keeping just-in-time inventory and the right logs for the right products. And so we don't carry large inventories. When we took our quad mill down for 2 weeks and Tillamook down for a week, we had all our log yards in Oregon shut down for a week. Since that time, they've been back open. We have been buying some less amount of volume because of those down, the down period. And also, the risk of, what's it going to be like in the future? You don't want to have a whole bunch of logs if you got to start taking curtailments. Of course, we got to balance that with it looks like it's going to be a bad fire year, and we can't run out of product for our home center customers. So as you might imagine at Hampton, we have a fair amount of robust discussion every week in terms of how much to buy, what prices to pay, things like that. But likely we'll have reduced volumes in the third or fourth quarter, I'm guessing, based on my forecast of kind of difficult times. But for the most part, we'll be buying logs pretty much every month, trying to protect some of our contractors as well. We want to keep busy. There's a lot of dynamics in it, but it's going to depend on, who's right in terms of how big of a recession we get. But for the most part, right now, we're buying logs at every mill.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Steve. So this one is for Rex, and it kind of goes off of just what Steve answered. So are contractors finding ways to pass additional costs onto owners or someone else? I mean, isn't this considered an act of God? Why should the contractors have to suffer?
Well, any contract is typically a negotiated agreement, and the terms of the agreement usually are in place for a term or a quantity of work. And so, usually there's not pass-through sorts of things, because if you're already on an existing agreement, you're going to meet the terms of that agreement. If you start a new agreement, then you have the opportunity to negotiate a new price. But as Steve just described, they're not very, the purchasers of the contract services may not be willing to take a lot of risks right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. Prices are lower, so it's just not a good time. There is, in our industry, there really isn't. You just don't pass on the price, the cost of doing business to the purchaser, because it's a commodity. The contractor selling contract service into a commodity market. There are many suppliers of the service and fewer buyers of the service, and so that's just the way it is.
All right. Thank you, Rex. This one's for Ron. With everyone staying at home, less people in the forest, you said that COVID-19 is resulting in more fires. How does COVID-19 increase fires?
Yeah, let me clarify a little bit. So one of the things we're seeing is increased human-caused fires in Southwest Oregon. That's a complication for us alongside preparing for fire season with COVID in the environment and the mitigation measures we have to take there. What's interesting is, that uptick in human-caused activity, we're not sure exactly why it is, but what we're seeing is escape debris burning. So anytime we see those spikes in, human-caused activity, we want to try to prevent those fires from happening in the future. So might not be directly related to COVID-19, although we know there's a lot of people who are at home. And so it might not be the forest sector that's out there, causing human-caused fires right now. Could be more backyard burners.
All right, excellent. This is also for you, Ron, and it kind of starts out tongue-in-cheek, but I think we'll turn it into serious. So are you looking for any 65-year-old firefighters with no training? Where would I apply? But just to put that in simpler terms, positive terms, what is the pipeline for people to get jobs in firefighting, either with ODF or with contractors?
Yeah, there's various ways, with ODF, online through our portal is where you can find information how to apply online, and the federal government has its own system as well. Contractors, the best advice I can give is go to our local ODF offices, and we do set up pre-season price agreements, if you would. There's no contract or guarantee for work, but our local districts, they look for an inventory of contractors that they can establish a relationship with ahead of season so that they can call upon them readily. And, it's not just the firefighter on the ground digging line. As many of you know, in your industries, there's a whole lot of support functions that go along with firefighting, from accounting and finance, to you name it, to the firefighter on the ground.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Ron. This question is for Tammy. So any thoughts on how the increased national debt that we're having with all the bailout stuff that's happening, all the support that's happening, how will this impact forestry businesses in the long term?
Yeah, honestly, I don't know. Anybody else want to take a crack at that one? Oh, see, it's not just me shy on that one.
Not just you. That's a tough question. Yeah.
That's a really tough question. Yeah, and that's something I would have to think really hard about. I don't know that I have a good answer for that right now.
Right. Good answer. If you don't have an answer, just say, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not going to try to crack that one.
Just Google it and see what you get. But I wouldn't do that in this case. So this one's for Gordon. Thanks, Tammy. Good shot. I saved the toughest question for you, of course.
Thanks.
So this is the one for Gordon, about where you showed the photo that was a release spraying or a relief spraying. They were unfamiliar with the term. So the one where the person spraying the grass, what do you call that and why?
Thank you. That is a release spray. Those were seedlings that were planted in December, and we're spraying to reduce competition from grass and broadleaves.
All right. This is an interesting one, and maybe this would be a good one for you to think about, Gordon. It's a long one, so listen. Not only is this person a small woodland owner, they're also a real estate broker. So it's interesting as they review the real estate market with tightening inventory as a greater number of sellers are holding off listing homes than buyers are buying. So the reduction of volumes in the timber industry, they're wondering if when the market comes back, there may be a greater shortage of new construction in the next year, or if more, that will drive the home values even higher. And that started out like a timber question, but it ended up more like a housing question. So any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that we were in a period of time that there was a demand for housing. And so I think that largely that demand is still there, although I think you have to be wondering, you know, how many people are concerned about their financial situation and their ability to take on a house, even though we have the very low interest rates. But I think that in my opinion, that, you know, the previous recession that we had was because there was a very lackluster demand in the economy, and that was driven by economics, where this recession, it's driven by an artificial factor. And so I think we could look for housing to recover more quickly.
All right. Steve, do you have any thoughts on that? That kind of sounds like what you said.
Yeah, Mike, I have seen some recent information that, you know, I don't even know who to call an expert anymore. You know, these people are experts on virus and experts on recessions, and I'm not sure anybody really knows at the end of the day. But I have seen some projections that don't expect house prices to drop very much just because there's so little of inventory. And so, you know, and especially in the West Coast where land is so expensive, I don't think you're going to see, you know, there might be certain parts of the country and stuff, but I think it's just going to kind of stall for a while and be low for a while. And like Gordon, it is going to come back. People still need a place to live. So I don't see house prices dropping so much, but it's going to be a credit issue and a consumer confidence issue, like Tammy said, in terms of when people can actually start buying houses again. But you aren't going to see the crash like we had before, where home prices drop 30 or 40%. I just don't see it.
All right. So this one, I put my face up just because I want you to see this is serious. This is one that Ron and Tammy and Glenn and I can't answer as state employees, but I'd love to hear, and in my little setup here, the three private guys are on the left, so it's perfect. So, and I'll read it just as it's written, but I won't say who wrote it. Is there any way that we can put pressure on the governor and the legislature to rescind the unfair corporate taxes that have been implemented so that this could help business? And I've seen this a lot out there in the world, that people are really concerned that here we have this COVID-19 crisis on top of the brand new high taxes prices, like a double whammy for business. So a lot of people might be in favor of it, but kind of politically, any chance of this happening you guys see?
I'll take the first shot at it. I certainly don't speak for the governor, but I've been involved in a number of meetings the last month or two, you know, where business has been meeting with the governor and talking about various ideas. And politically, it's not going to happen, right? She's made it clear she's not going to do that. She's kind of waffled on smaller amounts and the estimated timing of those and whether there's going to be penalties. You know, I give the state a lot of credit for how they've done the social distancing. The governor had the guts to keep construction open when they didn't do that in Washington and Northern California. So I think they've done a really good job, and it's difficult to decide how to bring people back, right? I mean, there's no easy answer. But when you look at what we're facing, we're going to have this huge shortfall in right when the state needs money to take care of people that are hurting, is when the money's not going to be there because the taxes are going to go down. You're going to have a huge unfunded liability on PERS. It's going to go from 26 billion to 40 or 45 billion, and all that's going to come together. And so I think the thinking of the government is like, I know it's tough, but we got to have some tax revenue coming. I can't afford to defer that revenue. I think that's the thinking. And unfortunately, like I'd mentioned earlier, we're going to see higher taxes. How you balance that with being fair to business so we don't lose more business is going to be a real challenge. I'm glad I'm not the governor or in the legislature.
Yeah. How about you, Mr. Storm? Any thoughts on this?
Well, the perspective I might add is governance, and state and federal governments are really good at issuing restrictions and restricting activity. They know how to do that very well, but there's not a lot of experience from governments of rescinding and reducing restrictions, regulations, or that sort of thing. So it just is unfamiliar territory where there's just more risk aversity to unwind the spool that's already been wound up.
Good. So I have two for Ron, so I'm going to split them, and I'll give you the toughest one first, because this occurred to me, is we've heard a lot about the ODF budget shortfall and the need for money. One of the stories is about the end of April, there'd be out of money if the E-board didn't come up with more. The E-board came up with more. But how does all this budget challenge affect your ability to fight fire?
That's a great question. And you touched on the E-board last week. When the E-board met, they supported the agency with the release of some of the special purpose appropriation funds. Some of those funds were from last fire season, so we've paid those bills, and the agency needs to recoup that money now and have it in our bank account, if you would, our cash flow. They also released the special purpose appropriation for this fire season so that we don't have to front that money as an agency up front, pay those bills. So that helps relieve some pressure. And then, there was also an additional special purpose appropriation in this biennial budget for us, and they've released that funding for us, and it broadened the funding a little bit so that it helps us prepare for COVID-19 for those extra cleaning items and personal protective equipment items that we need, so that we're not increasing further debt, right, by having to buy supplies that we didn't budget for and all of that. So there is some relief, I would say, and at least it's not complicating our budget issues right now. And fortunately, when we went into the biennial budget, we were funded at our current service level, from where we were. We didn't take drastic reductions and all that. So it's always challenging. Every agency can articulate that they need more, and there's certainly more we'd like to do. Right now, we're feeling pretty good about it.
All right, excellent. I'm really glad. This one is, I think this could be a Tammy or a Gordon or a Steve, and it's kind of, again, tongue-in-cheek, but with all the demand for toilet paper, are pulp prices going through the roof?
Now can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, the pulp market for chips is pretty flat. Before, when everything was going great and everybody was making a bunch of lumber and chips, the chip price has been dropping for about a year. It's stabilized now, pretty flat. The export market for chips out of Southern Oregon has not been good. So right now it's stabilized. Those guys are running pretty hard, but a lot of pulp mills don't make toilet paper. They make other products. Certainly packaging for Amazon, stuff like that has been good, but regular white paper used in offices has not. So it's a mixed bag, but so far all the pulp mills I know, at least in Oregon, are still running.
Anything to add, Tammy?
No, I think part of what Steve said, you've got everybody, pulp doesn't all go to toilet paper, and so it all depends where it goes. And certainly the white paper issue is something that we haven't really talked about. But with all of us working at home, we're probably printing a lot less. I know I am. We know that collectively we print a whole lot when we're in those buildings. And so seeing a whole lot less demand on white paper.
All right. One final question, and as I promised, it's for Ron, and this is, we've all seen in the paper about how smoke makes COVID-19 worse, and there's worry that we haven't been able to do enough prescribed burning because of the COVID-19. What's been the impact in Oregon?
Yeah, I think, the impact is, I can summarize it as, yes, we asked agencies to not burn, individuals to not burn, because we didn't want more smoke in the air, and we didn't want to impact, smoke sensitive populations already. In some respects, Mother Nature has been on our side a bit as far as helping that, in that there hasn't been as many good windows of opportunity to burn for a lot of people anyway. So, you know, regardless of the situation, people haven't had those opportunities. The trade-off, of course, is, you know, we still have fuel buildup that we would have liked to have reduced. And so we're aware of that. And, you know, as soon as, you know, in the fall season, hopefully when we can resume fall burning, we'll have that opportunity. What we have to do is, you know, a little bit be diligent about knowing where those fuel reserves are, those jackpots of fuel. Hope we don't get ignitions in those areas, right? That's the key is, you know, there's not a fire till there's ignition. But once there is, we've got to respond appropriately. And that's back to that aggressive, safe response that ODF provides.
All right. Well, thank you all. Great answer. I just want to give one more plug for the next week's videos. So next Tuesday afternoon in this time slot, we'll have Dana Sanchez talking about coyotes. And prior to that, at 10 a.m. next Tuesday, we'll have Daniel Lavelle talking about wildfire in our forest future. Thank you all for being with us today for COVID-19 in the forest sector. Thank you, panelists. You did marvelous. Thank you, audience. Great questions and just about the right amount of time. And golly, here we are, only 3 minutes over time. So enjoy the rest of your week. Please consider joining us next week or down the road, and share with others that this video will be available. So thank you very much, and have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you all panelists again, and see you at the next webinar.